The story began on a damp, overcast afternoon in the quiet suburban cemetery where Mark Thompson was laid to rest. The mood was somber, as befit the passing of a man who had been both a pillar in the business community and a figure shrouded in private complexity. Mourners gathered beneath a sprawling oak tree, some clutching handkerchiefs, others merely standing still with their thoughts. Mark's elder son, Jason, stood closest to the casket, his face a mask of dignified grief. He had always been perceived as the heir apparent, the one who would carry on his father's name and legacy. Friends and extended family positioned themselves nearby, offering silent support, while a soft murmur of conversation rose occasionally above the persistent hum of the city beyond the cemetery gates. The graveside service was brief, with respectful speeches from a few longtime colleagues and a distant relative. Jason accepted their condolences with quiet nods, but his mind already turned toward the next inevitable step, the reading of his father's will. That afternoon, as the sun briefly broke through the gray, the remaining crowd assembled at the Thompsons' family home, a stately house that had known both celebrations and secrets over the years. The lawyer, a man of careful expression, produced the document and began to read in a clear, measured tone. The will was surprisingly concise. Mark's final words to his family and friends were gracious and reflective of his faith in tradition. But it was the disposition of his estate that caused a stir. The lawyer announced, "I leave all my possessions to my son." There was a moment of confusion, followed by a sharp intake of breath from the assembled guests. All eyes turned toward Jason, who stood still, absorbing the words. He had always assumed he was the sole beneficiary, the only son, but now the vague phrasing made him uneasy. The simplicity of the statement, no name, no explicit direction, hung in the air, heavy with possibility. The lawyer paused, glancing at Jason as if to seek reassurance, but there was none to be found. Amid the muted reactions, a figure at the back of the room caught the attention of no one but the careful observer. This man, alone and dressed in clothes that suggested he was not among the regular guests, listened intently, his fists clenching involuntarily at the sound of the will's pronouncement. As the crowd began to disperse in a hushed blend of speculation and discomfort, he slipped out unnoticed, leaving behind a faint frown and a palpable sense of distress. No one at the gathering recognized him, and no one imagined how the cryptic last words of Mark Thompson would soon unravel the facade of the family's unity. Jason remained in the house after most had departed, sitting by the grand fireplace, turning the legal document over in his hands, scrutinizing every word for hidden meaning. He remembered the years spent at his father's side, learning the family business, absorbing advice, sometimes criticism, always striving to meet expectations. The ambiguity of the will gnawed at him. It was unlike his father to be imprecise. The unease in the room lingered, a silent echo of the questions that no one yet dared to ask. Who, exactly, was being named? And why had Mark chosen to phrase his legacy so ambiguously? Outside, the afternoon light faded, and the house began to settle into its usual rhythms. But a quiet tension remained. Jason walked slowly through the rooms, each corner bearing memories of his father's presence, each object a reminder of what now hung in the balance. In that moment, Jason knew only that nothing would ever be quite the same again, though he could not yet imagine the scale of the storm brewing on the horizon. The will had been read, but the story of Mark Thompson's sons was only just beginning. The mysterious figure who had slipped out after the will was read was Daniel, a man whose existence had always been defined by absence and longing. He was Mark's second son, born nearly 3 decades earlier from a brief, hidden relationship that neither Mark nor his family had ever spoken of publicly. Daniel's mother, a woman of quiet resilience, had raised him alone in a modest apartment on the other side of the city. She had told Daniel the truth about his father early on, but always cautioned him to be patient. Mark had obligations, reputation, complications. This became a familiar refrain throughout Daniel's childhood, a way of explaining away the dashed hopes and the lonely ache of unacknowledged lineage. As a boy, Daniel had watched his friends interact with their fathers, envying their easy familiarity, the casual affection, the sense of belonging. His mother worked long hours to support them, leaving him with books and sketch pads, which absorbed much of his loneliness. Occasionally, unexpected envelopes would arrive in the mail, never signed, never with a return address, but containing enough money to make a difference. His mother never explained, but Daniel knew. Sometimes after school, he would look up and imagine his father walking through the gates, finally ready to claim him. But those gates only opened to wind and leaves. There were rare moments, spaced far apart, when Daniel saw his father in person. Mark would appear at a school event, standing at the back, never approaching, never speaking. Daniel did not wave. He had learned not to hope. On 1 or 2 holidays, presents were left by the door. An expensive watch, a new jacket. Nothing personal, nothing handwritten. Once, on an especially bleak winter evening, Mark had knocked, not knowing the boy was home. Daniel had hidden behind the couch, listening to the awkward conversation between Mark and his mother, the awkward silences loud with unsaid things. Daniel grew into a quiet, reflective young man. He gravitated toward art, where he could pour his questions and disappointments onto the canvas. His work was honest, sometimes raw, but rarely recognized beyond a small circle of friends. He built a life from what he had, his mother's pride, a few commissions, the stubborn belief that he was more than an afterthought. Still, there was always the hope, lurking just beneath the surface, that one day his father might truly see him. Then the news came. Mark Thompson had died, and the world paid its hurried respects. Articles mentioned a devoted father and husband, listing accolades and achievements, but there was nothing about the son who had never been part of the family portrait. Daniel read the stories of Mark's legacy with a distant, detached bitterness. When he learned the will would be read publicly, he considered ignoring it, telling himself that nothing had changed, that he was not really part of this story. But curiosity and something deeper, call it a need to be present, if invisible, pulled him there. At the funeral, he came alone, lingering at the edges of the crowd. He saw Jason, Mark's public son, absorbing the condolences, wearing the mantle of loss perfectly. When the will was read, Daniel listened from the back, feeling the sudden, sharp sting of the words. All to my son. He had spent a lifetime waiting for some sign, some recognition, but now the will only made him invisible again. He had come hoping for one final lesson, one last chance, but his father's last act was to erase him, even from memory. He left quickly, walking away from the house, from the family, from the possibility of ever belonging. The city felt colder, the wind carrying the dust of unfinished words and unspoken apologies. Daniel did not cry. He had learned not to expect much from his father, after all. He walked until his feet ached, passing shop windows that reflected his face, blurred with shadows and the echoes of a past that would never truly belong to him. He went home to his paintings, to the only place he had ever really been seen, and tried to push the ache away, knowing that something had ended, both for his father and for himself. After the reading of the will, Jason began the process of assuming control over his father's considerable estate and business holdings. He met with company executives and legal advisors, poring over documents and signatures, immersing himself in the details of succession and transfer. No one at the office raised any questions. As far as they were concerned, Jason was the legitimate heir, the face of continuity in the wake of his father's passing. Jason handled each meeting with quiet confidence, though underneath there lingered a faint but persistent unease, a memory of the will's ambiguous wording, a loose thread that he could not quite pull free. Still, he pushed onward, focusing on the task before him, trusting that time and routine would smooth out his uncertainties. While Jason worked quietly in his father's office, Daniel wrestled with a very different set of concerns. His mother, seeing her son's disillusionment, encouraged him at last to stand up for what was rightfully his. Their conversations were fraught with emotion. She knew the pain of secrecy and the cost of invisibility, but she also understood that the time for silence had passed. With her support, Daniel reached out to a local attorney, a woman who specialized in inheritance and contested estates. There, in her modest but well-ordered office, Daniel recounted his story for the first time. The lawyer listened carefully, asking for any evidence that could substantiate his claims. Together, they began piecing together the fragments of his past. Daniel brought out an old shoebox containing faded letters Mark had sent. Never signed, always brief, but unmistakably addressed to his mother and, in a few rare cases, to Daniel himself. There were photographs, too, some with the dates and places marked in careful handwriting, others blurry and yellowed but still recognizable. The lawyer arranged for a paternity test, and after a tense wait, the results confirmed what Daniel had always known. He was Mark Thompson's biological son. Armed with this proof, the attorney explained that the will was ripe for challenge. Its phrasing, "all to my son," was ambiguous, and under the law, the estate might be open to claims from all legitimate children, regardless of public recognition or family silence. She outlined the steps ahead: a formal petition to the court, public notice, and the inevitable scrutiny of the family's affairs. What had been a private sorrow was about to become a very public matter. Daniel hesitated, aware of the storm he might unleash, but he knew that turning back now would only reinforce a lifetime of hidden pain. When the legal papers were filed, the story quickly reached the media. Local reporters, always eager for a drama involving wealth and family secrets, seized on the case. The headlines spun a narrative tinged with scandal and sympathy. Business titan's secret son challenges will, undisclosed children, inheritance upheaval. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some viewed Daniel as a figure of injustice, deserving of recognition and recompense. Others questioned his motives, painting him as opportunistic and disruptive. The Thompson family, once private and respected, found itself under unaccustomed scrutiny, with every detail of Mark's life and behavior dissected in the press and online. Jason, preoccupied with the daily demands of his new responsibilities, was stunned when the news broke. He stared at the headlines, struggling to reconcile the image of his father, strict, controlled, devoted, with the revelations now circulating. He recalled the cryptic will, the strange man he had never noticed at the funeral, the sense that something was not quite right. As journalists and curious acquaintances began reaching out, Jason realized that his challenge would not merely involve business decisions and paperwork, but a reckoning with his own assumptions about family, trust, and inheritance. The legal battle had begun, and with it, a public reshuffling of everything that had once seemed settled. The news of Daniel's existence and the legal challenge sent Jason into a state of uncertainty he had never experienced before. He had spent his life believing he was his father's only son, the sole inheritor of his responsibilities and legacy. Now, confronted by the media frenzy and the legal papers on his desk, he found himself driven to seek the truth in the only place it could still be found: his father's private files and personal effects. Jason began his search late one evening, methodically combing through his father's study. The room had been left largely untouched since Mark's death, and as Jason opened drawers and flipped through folders, he became increasingly aware of the gap between his father's public persona and the private life that had so carefully been kept hidden. In one locked cabinet, he found a collection of old journals, bound in leather, each filled with the neat, disciplined handwriting he recognized immediately. As he read, Jason encountered a side of his father that was unknown to him, introspective, sometimes regretful, always conscious of the image he had cultivated. Interspersed among the business notes and personal reflections were occasional references to a woman and a boy, never named, but always described with a hint of affection and remorse. The entries spanned years, chronicling visits made in secret, financial support sent anonymously, and the gnawing sense that he had failed to do justice by someone who deserved it. Jason had never imagined his father capable of such complexity, and the discovery unsettled him. The man he had venerated as a pillar of integrity now seemed less certain, less complete. The most revealing find, however, was an unsealed letter, tucked away in a back drawer, never mailed. It was addressed to Daniel, plainly, without explanation, and written in a tone Jason had never heard his father use. In it, Mark confessed his regret for never acknowledging Daniel as his son, for withholding his name and presence from the world. He wrote of pride in Daniel's achievements, of guilt for the distance between them, and of the enduring hope that, one day, their bond might be recognized. But the letter also laid bare the reason for Mark's silence: his fear of scandal, of the damage to his reputation and business, of the upheaval it would cause within both families. He had chosen duty and image over honesty, and the letter ended without closure, as if Mark himself could not resolve the contradiction. Jason sat with these revelations for a long time, the weight of his father's choices pressing on him. He began to see his own privileged position in a new light, not as a natural birthright, but as the result of someone else's loss. Memories of childhood moments, of his father's rare absences and unexplained moods, took on new meaning. At the same time, he could not ignore a creeping sense of anxiety. If Daniel's claim was upheld, Jason stood to lose not only a portion of his inheritance, but also his social status as the undisputed heir. The world had always known him as Mark's only son. Now that certainty was shattered. His feelings lay in ambivalence. He sympathized with Daniel's loneliness and the hidden years, but he also resented the intrusion into what had felt like an orderly future. He questioned his father's motives and his own sense of right and wrong, torn between upholding the family's public image and making amends for the past's omissions. For the first time, Jason faced the realization that knowing the truth was not always a comfort. Sometimes, it complicated things beyond repair. As he replaced the letter and journals in their drawer, he understood that whatever happened next would redefine not just the family's fortunes, but also his understanding of what it meant to be Mark Thompson's son. Jason reached out to Daniel through his lawyer, and after an exchange of guarded messages, they agreed to meet at their father's old office, the heart of the business empire that had both defined the Thompson legacy and, in ways they were only beginning to understand, divided their own lives. The atmosphere in the room was charged with the weight of all that had been left unspoken between them. Years of silence now distilled into a single, inevitable moment. Daniel arrived just as the shadows of the afternoon stretched across the office. He was quieter and more withdrawn than Jason expected, his eyes glancing over the familiar furniture and photographs of strangers who should have been family. Jason, for his part, struggled to reconcile the flesh-and-blood man before him with the abstract figure from the headlines. Someone who should have been a sibling, but was, at best, an uncomfortable reminder of secrets long buried. There was no initial warmth between them, only a careful, guarded tension. Accusations hung in the air, unspoken, but deeply felt. Daniel's sense of having lived a life in the margins was written in his posture and the tone of his voice, while Jason's anxiety about losing what he had always considered his birthright revealed itself in measured, sometimes clipped responses. Both wanted answers, but neither was sure if they could trust the other to give them. Jason saw the hurt in Daniel's eyes, the years of being unseen and unclaimed, and found himself wanting to bridge the gap, however awkwardly. He produced the unsent letter from his father's private papers, offering it to Daniel as evidence of the truths he himself had only recently uncovered. The letter trembled slightly as Daniel took it, his focus narrowing to the lines that bore his name. As he read, his face registered first confusion, then dismay, and finally a kind of reluctant but undeniable relief. The words on the page made it clear. His father had known him, had thought of him, had even loved him after a fashion, but ultimately had not found the courage to face the consequences of that love. Daniel's bitterness seeped out as he spoke of Mark's choices. the sacrifices made for reputation, the costs of secrecy and silence. He told Jason of the birthday cards unsigned, the school plays unattended, the graduations that happened with only one parent present. But for all the anger, Daniel was also visibly shaken by the tangible proof that his father had regretted his absence, that there had been, beneath the public veneer, a man who grieved his own inability to be honest. Jason listened, hearing in Daniel's words not just a story of abandonment, but also one of resilience and the longing for belonging. He began to recognize his own fears, not only of losing wealth or status, but of having had everything he valued revealed as something less than he imagined. He saw, too, that he had perhaps inherited more than just a company. He had also inherited his father's habit of avoiding difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths. As the sun set and the city lights flickered on outside the office window, the conversation turned inward. Each man spoke of his childhood, of the ways in which Mark's presence, or absence, had shaped him. They did not reconcile in the classic sense. There was no embrace, no sudden understanding. But something quiet and incremental occurred. They saw each other more clearly, not as strangers or rivals, but as two sons who had been dealt different hands by the same man, both left searching for something neither could quite name. By the time they parted, the room was colder, and the silence between them somehow lighter, freighted less with suspicion and more with something approaching mutual recognition. Both understood that the truth, however painful, was better than the fictions that had shaped their lives. There was no resolution yet, but the possibility of one now existed, a fragile, tentative hope that, after all the years of hiding and misunderstanding, the past might finally be reckoned with. With the truth laid bare between them, Jason and Daniel chose to settle their dispute through mediation rather than a protracted legal battle. The process, though formal and sometimes awkward, allowed each to speak plainly about their expectations and fears. Both agreed that a fair division of their father's estate was the only just outcome, but it was not just about money or property. It was about recognition, about being seen as Mark's sons in equal measure. With the guidance of their attorneys, they arrived at an arrangement that acknowledged their shared parentage and the different circumstances of their lives, ensuring that neither would feel wholly excluded or unfairly favored. While the legal details were being hashed out, the broader story of the Thompson brothers became a sensation far beyond the confines of their city. The media picked up on the human drama, highlighting not just the wealth at stake, but the emotional journeys of two men brought together by their father's choices. Social media erupted with debate. Some praised the brothers for their transparency and fairness. Others scrutinized their motives, but most saw a reflection of broader questions about family, responsibility, and the meaning of legacy. Public figures weighed in, sparking conversations about absent fathers, secret children, and the consequences of prioritizing reputation over honesty. The initial scandal gradually turned into something more thoughtful, with strangers offering support or shared stories of their own hidden pains. Perhaps unexpectedly, Jason and Daniel discovered that while they were unlikely ever to become close friends, respect was possible where there had once been only suspicion. They began to meet occasionally, not out of obligation, but because there was, at least, a mutual curiosity about the person who had lived parallel yet unknown parts of their lives. Their interactions were polite, sometimes tense, but always honest, as if both understood that pretending to anything more would be as hollow as the secrecy that had separated them before. Together, they decided to direct a portion of their inheritance toward the creation of a fund dedicated to supporting children who, like Daniel had once been, were living without recognition or clarity about their own parentage. The announcement brought renewed attention to their story, but this time the focus was less on scandal and more on the possibility of redemption. The fund became a tangible legacy, transforming the pain of the past into something potentially hopeful for others. It was their way of acknowledging that their own experience, however difficult, might at least spare someone else some measure of the loneliness and uncertainty they had endured. Mark's will, once a symbol of exclusion and unfinished business, took on a new meaning. No longer was it simply a source of conflict. It had become a catalyst for openness, for confronting uncomfortable truths, and for the possibility of reconciliation. The Thompson brothers understood that family could not always be defined by name or fortune, and that inheritance was not simply about what a person received, but about what they chose to do with it. The story had begun with loss and misunderstanding, but its ending suggested that, even in the wake of secrecy, there could still be small steps toward healing and an opportunity to build something better from the past's shadows.